Hi everybody, welcome to Dram Daddy Whiskey. I'm Dan, and tonight we're gonna drink some whiskey, some bourbon whiskey from MGP. It's their limited edition that they release every year. It's got one of the most beautiful ornate bottles in the market, but I don't have one. We're talking about Remus Repeal Reserve VI. I wasn't able to come across a decently priced Remus Repeal Reserve VI until I had already secured a sample. And when I did come across one, it was about the reasonable price, around $110, $115 before tax, which I think is what you're gonna look at to find this one. But I figured I hadn't even tried the sample yet, so give this thing a go and then try to get one if it ends up being worth it. I'll let you know at the end of the video whether I think this is one that I'm gonna hunt after I try it for the first time here today. So let's pour this sucker in a little bit and let it set while we talk about what we're drinking. Remus Repeal Reserve is MGP's yearly limited edition bourbon. It's actually put out under the name Ross Squibb, which is a new brand that MGP put out, I think a couple years ago, 1 or 2 years ago, to release some of their in-house products. So George Remus Bourbon and Rossville Union Rye are both under the Ross Squibb umbrella, which is under the MGP of Indiana umbrella. So I believe when you have a non-distilling producer or some other distiller who has secured product from MGP, they are getting it from MGP. But when MGP is making their own product and releasing it under their own brand, it's from Ross Squibb. And where the George Remus Bourbon is the brand that Ross Squibb produces for MGP, Remus Repeal Reserve is the higher end version of that bourbon, released once a year. Remus Repeal Reserve V got a whole lot of hype. It was a hitter by most accounts. It had some really, really old MGP bourbon in it. Remus Repeal Reserve VI is a little younger. There are 5 bourbons used to blend Remus Repeal Reserve VI. The vast majority of those bourbons are 8 years old or 10 years old, 2 of each. 2% of the total blend is from a 14-year-old bourbon. Of those 5 bourbons, there are actually 2 different mash bills, but they're both high rye, 21% and 36% rye. This is a high rye bourbon, which is pretty common for MGP stuff, and it's pretty decently aged, 8 to 10 years at a minimum, with a little pinch of 14-year-old bourbon in there too. If we're lucky, we'll be able to pull out some sweet oak notes from this. Remus Repeal V was pretty good with that, and at the end of this video, we're gonna compare. On the nose. Oh, it's sweeter than I expected. This is the first time I've smelled this, first time I've tried it. So I am totally blind going into this. Almost reminds me a little bit of like a Barton product, like a 1792 or something. Except a little less on the mint, a little more on like cinnamon and nutmeg. And it's less of a bubblegummy sort of sweetness, more of like a brown sugar sweetness that's going on in here. Do pick up a little bit of the ethanol too. I can't tell if I'm picking up on any oak. I'm hoping that some of the sweetness and some of the spice I'm smelling is actually the oak influence on this that's making the spices seem a little bit spicier and the sweetness maybe a little, hopefully on the brown sugar maple sort of side, but I think we'll have to taste this to find out. So let's do it. It's definitely sweeter on the palate than I would have guessed on the nose, but whoa. Then on the back, you get hit with the spice. So this has a really clear, at least on the first sip, transition from front to back palate where it's sweet up front. You're getting, I guess it's just the corn notes, where I'm getting less brown sugar than I was on the nose, but more of like a straightforward kind of vanilla sweetness. And then it kind of pops in the back palate and on the finish with that rye spice. Finish is still lasting a little bit, mainly with sweetness. That rye spice fades a little bit. It's pretty good. Second sip. So second sip is pretty consistent with the first, with the sweetness that then transitions to spiciness on the back. It is a little bit more drying this time, particularly on the mid palate, a little more tannic, and I am picking up a little bit more of that oak as well. I think all of those things kind of go together. It's good, the oak influence. It's not as strong as I might have hoped, and it's not as sweet as I might have hoped, but it is nice that it's starting to come through a little bit more as I'm taking a second sip. Sip number 3. Yeah, the oak is coming through more each time I drink this, and it's kind of creeping up from the spice in the back palate oak to the mid palate. And maybe if I keep drinking it, it'll just be oaky altogether. Could be that my palate's just getting kind of screwed by all the tannins right now. I don't know. The interesting thing about this is I could see this being almost crushable if you're okay with that explosion of rye spice in the back. And it wouldn't really seem to be that complex if you were just down in this. If you were not really thinking about it, kind of like, I don't know, drinking at a party or something like that, or watching a movie and just taking sips. But if you think about it, it does evolve quite a bit on the palate, especially as you drink more of it. Sweetness up front, oak in the mid palate, rye spice in the back palate, and then it kind of goes backwards in the finish, going from rye spice to oak to sweetness again. But the oak is lingering a little bit more this time, I guess. I've got a little bit left. I don't want to finish this before I compare this to last year's. I do want to score and grade Remus Repeal 6 before I compare it to Remus Repeal 5. The whiskey in the bottle. The complexity is nice. I do wish the age came through a little bit more because it doesn't taste like a particularly aged bourbon. The oak is there, but it's not there more than some 10, 12-year bourbons that are on the market, which makes total sense because 98% of this bourbon is 8 and 10-year-old bourbon. And it's kind of tough to pay 110, 115, maybe even more on a bourbon that's mainly made of 8 and 10-year-old stock and is only 100 proof. I don't know that I mentioned that, but it's 50% ABV, 100 proof, which is, I think, kind of a good middle ground between like a casual drinker and someone who's really into bourbon. But that's quite an ask to charge over $100 for a not particularly well-aged bourbon that's not barrel proof. I mean, really, just a few years ago, it probably wouldn't have been uncommon for most distillers to add a little bit of older stock into their younger or small batch release bourbon, something that's like lower level for them, just to give it a little extra, flair, some extra great taste to it. And Ross and Squibb, I mean, we're used to them listing out all the bourbons that are in it, so maybe it didn't seem as alarming or weird that there was only 2% of like a really older bourbon in here, but it's almost like they're pulling over on us a little bit. If this was a small batch release, it just would have been called an 8-year product. Maybe I should go more to the grade. In fact, I think it should. So the whiskey in the bottle, it was good. I wouldn't say it was great. I liked that it was complex and that it evolved over your palate, but nothing about it really wowed me in any respect. So Remus Repeal Reserve VI gets from me a 7.5. It's good bourbon, maybe very good. In the grade, so taking into account how hard it is to find, how expensive it is, the overall presentation, the experience of drinking it, all things considered. The price point on this is really disappointing for me. This is a limited edition product, but it's not high proof. It's only 50% ABV, 100 proof. And it's not really that aged. You could say there's some 14-year-old bourbon in here, but it's only 2%. The other 98% is just 8-year-old and 10-year-old bourbon, and they're kind of close to each other. In years past, it wasn't uncommon at all for there to be distillers who would release their bourbon with a lower age statement, maybe like 8 or 9 or 10 years, whatever, but that would include some older stock just to smooth out the edges, or maybe add a little bit of oak influence and just increase the flavor profile overall. But they wouldn't list out every single component. They would just put an age statement on there equivalent to the youngest bourbon in the blend. That's the law. That's how people do it. We're so used to Ross and Squibb listing out all of the components of Remus Repeal Reserve that I feel like it flew under the radar a little bit, that there's really only one pretty well-aged bourbon in here, and it's only 2%. My point is, in years past, this would have just been called like a small batch 8-year-old bourbon. But because it's Remus Repeal Reserve VI, it's got a little bit of awe associated with it. I'm not really impressed with that. The grade I'm gonna give this release, because it was good bourbon, but it is overpriced and it is underproofed, is a C-. I'm probably glad that I didn't pull the trigger on getting a bottle, at least not at that price. So now it's time to compare to Remus Repeal Reserve V. So I was fortunate enough to find a bottle of Remus Reserve V last year for a pretty good price, pretty soon after its release, and I kept a few ounces of it because I knew it was something special. I want to be totally upfront about this. I am going into this biased. I really, really, really liked Remus Repeal Reserve V, and based on the younger ages of the bourbons that were blended to make Remus Repeal 6, I kind of went into that thinking maybe I wouldn't enjoy it quite as much. But let's compare and see. All right. Okay, this is amazing. It's sweet, it's oaky. There's less spice than Remus Repeal Reserve VI. Oh, but that sweet oak more than makes up for it. Some maple syrup. Oh, a little bit of pound cake, something like that. Like not a super strong vanilla, but like a really dense, cakey vanilla flavor. Oh, and there's some spice on there too. Maybe that might be the oak, but it comes a little bit after the sweetness if you dig deep for it. On the palate. It's so good. It's so well balanced. It's just sweet oak through and through. There's definitely not as much evolution on the palate as there was with the 6. It doesn't really change from one thing to the other. Instead, it's just the same awesome thing throughout. Sweet oak, baby. Ooh, so good. Yeah, and it sticks around. There's a little bit of ethanol if you catch it in the wrong spot of your palate. But that fades quickly, and you're just left with that sweet, sweet oak. Back to 6. Yeah, darker on the nose, which I wouldn't have thought. Not picking up on as much of the spices go around, but it might be because there's barely any in here. Yeah, it's got darker notes in comparison to the Remus and so much less sweet. I think that's really the thing, is comparing it to the 5. The 5 was just so sweet. It presented that oak in a great sweet way, and the 6 doesn't. The oak influence from both of these is kind of drowning out my palate a little bit. I hope you had a chance to know that it's worth it to pull the trigger on 6, but if you think differently, let us know in the comments. I'm really interested in hearing if people do have a different take on this one tonight, and I need to reconsider and go out and buy a bottle if I could find one. What notes you all pick up too. So leave one, start a discussion, let us know. Until next time, cheers. This is the 5, by the way. Delicious.